It's Monday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative MP Bim Afalami, Shadow Skills Minister Toby Perkins, former Conservative MP Anne Widdecombe and the New Statesman's Alva Ray. Today, is it too late for diplomatic efforts to avert war in Ukraine?
We have to accept at the moment that Vladimir Putin is possibly thinking illogically about this.
The last remaining COVID restrictions are expected to be lifted in England.
We've got to get the balance right to allow people their freedoms back, to make sure that we're not dictating as government how people live, how people run their businesses.
The worry about lifting the legal restrictions is that we're telling not only our population but the world that there's really nothing to worry about.
And Labour's deputy leader talks tough.
On things like law and order, I'm like quite hard line. I'm like, shoot a terrorist and ask the question second.
Let's start with the crisis in Ukraine. The US President Joe Biden and his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin have agreed in principle to attend a summit on the situation, but the intelligence is still suggesting that an invasion is being planned. Some sources saying it has, to some extent, already begun. Everyone is talking about these pictures that were released over the last 24 hours or so of these Russian tanks amassing along the Ukrainian, or certainly close to the Ukrainian border. They have this mysterious marking of the letter Z that you can see there on the side. There's been speculation about precisely what those markings mean. It's been suggested it's to avoid friendly fire from Russian planes once the invasion begins. My question to start the programme for the panel is, Boris Johnson says that Vladimir Putin is illogical, irrational to some extent. So are sanctions and diplomacy enough to stave off war, Bim?
Well, I hope so. And the Prime Minister said that it's very, very difficult to get inside Vladimir Putin's head, as I think everybody, not just in this country, but in other countries, recognises. I think the fundamental point with this, because I think we'd all agree that, that we don't want to see war in the Ukraine. I think all of us would agree that. I think the fundamental point is, can the West maintain this unity that we've seen on taking a hard line against Russia? And in particular, not just in the unity in military terms, as we've done, but going forward with sanctions. For those to be effective, it will need the whole European Union, Britain, the United States and the whole West to unite to make sure those sanctions are as effective as possible if it comes to that.
Right, you say the West has been united in terms of its hardline stance, but you will know, Toby, that Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky has actually criticised some Western nations for perhaps not being tough enough. I mean, do you think the combination so far will avert war?
Well, I mean, firstly, I think that a lot of Putin's sort of actions and also what his response, what he wants out of this, isn't that unpredictable. Actually, I think he's operated largely in this way over Georgia and over the bringing down of planes, actions in Salisbury. What Putin understands is weakness and aggression, and I think that this country particularly has been very mixed in its messaging. The government and Conservative Party particularly taken very little action on Russian corruption and Russian money within the Conservative Party. And I think Putin sees that prevarication and sees it as a sign to sort of push at us.
And what do you think?
I think that sanctions would be enough if, and it's a mighty big if, they were first of all, as Bim says, united. I mean, that they come from not just us, not just the EU and not just the United States, but from the West in combination. And if they are tough enough, I think our real problem is, and we all know this, that there are major countries in the West, countries like Germany, which are very, very dependent on Russian gas and who may get cold feet. And I think the crucial thing with standing up to a man like Putin, is that we show that we are equally as determined as he is, and that what we do and what we say is what we actually mean and aren't just idle threats. And that's crucial. That's what I haven't seen in all of this.
Alva?
We've seen a perception, Western leaders go to Putin. What we haven't seen is a united stance from the West.
Alva?
I think it's tricky because, I mean, what does Putin really want from this? I suppose he either wants to see some sort of win over the West, some sort of humiliation, sort of, expose weaknesses, divisions between different Western countries, to play to his base at home, a show of strength, some kind of guarantee that there'll be some sort of Western retreat in Ukraine, and less of a Western influence there. He either wants that, or he needs to be disincentivized from war there. I don't know if sanctions will be enough, and I also don't really know what, as Boris Johnson has said, Putin is a quite unpredictable figure. Who knows what the Russian calculation is about whether war would be possible, whether they would have the means to do it, the huge loss of life for Russians as well as Ukrainians. I think that's kind of what we're dealing with. But certainly the first thing isn't going to happen. It looks, there isn't going to be any sort of win or easy victory to humiliate the West. And if there is, that would be terrible for everyone here as well.
Well, and of course, we'll bring you any... Yeah, sorry, Anne, go on.
I think we know what he wants, because he's pretty well said it. What he wants is for Ukraine to drop any application for membership of NATO and for NATO not to make any further advances in that part of the world. That's what he wants. That's what this is about. It isn't just that he wants to humiliate us. He's got a reason. He wants to stop the advance of NATO. But NATO is a defensive alliance, not an aggressive alliance.
Yes.
And it's up to Ukraine whether it wants to join or not.
Right, but on that, Bim, we heard at the weekend the Prime Minister saying he'll get more of NATO, not less of NATO. I mean, is that sort of stance having an impact in terms of averting war?
Well, we don't know. But what I do know is that this government, the Prime Minister in particular, has received plaudits all over the world for his speech at the Munich Security Conference, which was over the weekend, because of the absolutely resolute stance that we've taken. NATO isn't just a defensive alliance in military terms, it's also a broader political defensive alliance. Again, looking at whether it be tackling Russian corruption, sanctions, all of these things need to be brought together.
Yeah, which Toby says the government hasn't done enough.
But, well, the problem is in opposition, and look, Toby's a good guy. Oppositions will always say the government hasn't done enough. The government has worked incredibly hard with other countries on this agenda and will continue to do so.
All right, let's talk about domestic issues and COVID, because the Prime Minister is due to give a statement to Parliament this afternoon on the government's broad strategy of living with COVID. Included in that was going to be the move to bring forward by a month, dropping the legal requirement to self-isolate if you test positive with COVID, and also some discussion about ending free testing. Now, just before we came on air, we heard that the Cabinet meeting scheduled to sign off on the strategy of the government towards this had been delayed this morning because of a row going on. We can just show you this tweet by the BBC's political editor, Laura Kunsberg. I'm told Department of Health asked Number 11 for more than £5 billion extra last week to maintain more free testing. That's, for example, testing of NHS staff, even if they didn't have symptoms. By Saturday, Department of Health demanded down to £3 billion, but warned of cuts elsewhere if no more money. By Sunday, Department of Health down to £1.8 billion. So you can see there is some sort of trading battle going on between the departments in terms of how much money can actually be saved. Bim, what's your reaction? Should free testing end or not?
Well, we'll see the Prime Minister's plan when he comes out with it this afternoon.
What do you think? Because clearly it's under discussion.
Well, it's under discussion. What I think is we need to move to a new phase of dealing and managing COVID so that it's in an endemic phase rather than in the emergency phase it's been in for the best part of 2 years. So I think that the emergency phase is one where you have free testing. I think that we've got to now get to a point where we don't just have free testing, because we don't test for absolutely everything and we can't continue doing that. However, exactly the speed at which we do that, I think, is up for discussion.
Right, but do you understand there is a controversy here? The idea that you're going to drop the legal requirement for people to self-isolate if they test positive, and at the same time maybe taking away the very thing that could reassure people whether they've got COVID or not. They could just have a cold, of course. You may end up in a situation where people are staying at home, they do what the government has said, take personal responsibility. I've got a cold, I've got a cough, I haven't got a test available because they're not free. I'm going to stay at home anyway, and we're back in the situation we were at the beginning.
Well, we're not in the same situation because of the vaccine rollout, because of the boosters.
No, but you will if people stay home and they can't get access to free tests.
Well, first of all, a lot of people will still get tested if they are not free. Secondly, to the extent that people don't, the disease has moved to a point where it is much less dangerous. And so we've got to leave individuals and businesses and communities and families to make much more of these decisions. We cannot continue in a world of the government micromanaging absolutely every single action of everybody when it comes to one particular illness.
Well, do you agree?
That's why we've got to move forward.
Do you agree with that in principle, Toby, that this is time to move on? It's time for people to take more responsibility themselves and drop the legal requirement?
Well, the whole point is that the government are making it more difficult for people to take personal responsibility by removing access to testing, both in terms of the cost and also availability of those tests. And precisely those free tests are so important because they allowed people to take personal responsibility. So I think you're right. I think it doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make health sense. And it is part of a wider spread view that a Prime Minister is having a health strategy based on saving his own seat in as the Prime Minister rather than based on what the health advice that he's receiving.
And you're shaking your head, but many people will say this is about saving Boris Johnson's leadership. It's about pacifying people within his own party. And actually, just to continue with more of what Laura Kunzberger is reporting in terms of cash available to pay for tests, free available tests, it looks as if the talks between the Department of Health and Treasury now settled with no extra cash. Plan seems instead to move money around within existing Department of Health budget. Do you agree with that?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think it is a red herring and just an excuse to try and prolong the Partygate issue to say that the Prime Minister is doing this to save his own skin. Now, you've also said he may be doing it to pacify members of his own party. Now, it's quite true. There are an awful lot of people in his own party, and I would have been one of them had I still been in Parliament, who have been demanding that we get back to a high degree of normality, particularly when Omicron, and I'm sorry I do pronounce it that way, has proved not to be particularly deadly at all. We've got to get back to normality, and I think he's right to do this. And indeed, if you ask me, is it too soon? I would say it's much too late. And as for the budget that you just raised and moving money around between departments, look, we're all grown-ups. We all know that when government is being asked to fund a particular initiative, and COVID has cost us billions upon billions, tens of billions, we know that government has to find the money somewhere. And therefore, it may be that particular departments have to bear a share of that.
All right.
In budgeting. I'm sorry, but that's just a fact of life, boring though it is.
Alva?
Well, I think it's just really clear that, I mean, despite BIM's sort of delicate dance around it there, that actually lots of Conservative MPs are quite nervous about this aspect of the changes. This is very popular among Conservative MPs in general. They've wanted to see the end of restrictions for a long time. It's very convenient timing for Boris Johnson to be doing this now while his leadership is in crisis. But this aspect of it, ending free testing, is something that, you know, BIM is slightly struggling to defend in terms of the timetable of it because it does feel premature, and that's certainly, I think, privately what people are saying.
BIM?
Well,
is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is we have to... We know where the end point is, which is being back to normal.
Yeah, but are you
and we need to do that as
the
quickly
idea
as
of ending
possible.
free testing, which is where the government is heading?
Well, I don't think anybody's proposing that there'll be no free tests available anywhere in the country.
But for broad swathes of the population, and said it's the right thing to do anyway.
Well, there is a process to go from where we are now to being in the position where we're living completely normally. And it's just how we manage the next few weeks and months, I think, is up for debate. But the fundamental point, I want to be really, really clear about this on free testing, is that we cannot continue indefinitely with a situation where we're spending 5, 6, 7 billion pounds a month for something that is endemic in the population that is one particular disease. We've got to move to a more normal phase.
I mean, it's a lot of money, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, I think it's, really alarming to see Laura Kuenssberg's tweets there because, the idea that in the Department of Health, with the massive waiting list we have, I have people coming to my constituency surgeries that are now likely to die of cancer that they wouldn't have done if they'd have got treatment in line with normal waiting times. And so to take more money out of the Department of Health budget to keep some kind of testing regime going is only going to mean that those backlogs get worse.
Right, but do you think there shouldn't be any free testing at all then, that perhaps that money can be saved and put back into...
No, I don't. I think there should be free testing. I think that testing actually saves money. It enables people to make those decisions. It enables some of them to get back to work. And I think you will actually see people staying off work because they're not sure what's wrong with them if they can't access the test. So I think it's illogical.
Anne?
I think we've got to learn now to live with what we have. We're vaccinated very heavily. We've got a very mild strain at the moment. We've got to get back to normality. And I do not believe that merely postponing endlessly and saying, well, we'll just do this and we'll just do that, is actually going to break through what I now consider is one of the biggest problems we've got, which is that people have been made very, very afraid. And a lot of people will find it very difficult to act normally. And that is what we've got to get people to do. And I'm sorry to say that, but I think that no matter how many restrictions are lifted, there are still going to be people who will be acting as if we were still in the middle of the original outbreak.
Toby?
I think some people with very significant health situations, of course they're going to be afraid. They've seen, we've had higher death numbers per population than France, than Germany, than Spain, and Portugal, than virtually the majority of major nations of our sort. And so with good cause they should be concerned about this. Of course we have moved on. We are vaccinated largely and people need to be sensible about that. But the sense all the way through, ever since Sajid Javid was appointed, was that we had a government that were looking to celebrate, as we see, a return to normality, rather than listen to the health advice and make decisions on that basis. And I think listening to the sage restrictions would still give people more confidence going forward than the kind of approach this Prime Minister's taking.
Anne?
If we'd listened to the health advice and some of the modelling that we got, we'd still all be in lockdown. I mean, we've got to be reasonable about this. We've got to look at the situation as it is, not as it was, and we've got to go forward on that basis. And I do have to throw in this. It is wrong to say that we have a higher proportion of deaths in the population, a higher absolute number, yes, but actually when you do population per million, we come out pretty well.
No, it's not true.
In Europe.
It's not true.
Well, we're not the highest, though, are we, in terms
absolutely
of proportion? But the actual overall number is high, isn't it? And there we are much closer to the top.
In proportionate terms, our death rate is higher than the majority of those countries, say Germany, France, Spain, Portugal. I've looked at it before I came onto your show today.
Bim?
Yeah, and I've also looked at it because I was doing an article on it last week. So unless it's changed in the last 48 hours, I think that is very unlikely. The total number, yes.
Right. Let's just make it clear. Let's just make it clear for our viewers. In terms of the total number, we are extremely high compared to other comparable countries in the EU. But in terms of the proportion, we are actually about halfway down the list of comparable countries.
That is true. Proportionately, we are not.
Absolutely. No, that's true.
But yeah. if you look at the total number of deaths, just remember, by the government's own admission, those aren't necessarily deaths from COVID. They're not. They're deaths that have occurred within 28 days.
Yes.
Positive
well,
COVID
would you
deaths.
accept that, Toby?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, the statistics I looked at today, so we were 27th highest death rate of 150 nations in total with COVID. And, the excess death rate that we've had here has been very substantial.
But the point that Anne is making is that it might not have been as a direct result. Some people died with COVID as opposed to from.
Well, some of them might be. The excess death rates are outstanding in comparison to normal times.
Bim?
Well, what I wanted to say was that Labour, if it was up to Labour, In the summer, we'd have gone into lockdown. Over Christmas,
no, over
we'd have
Christmas,
gone into
what
lockdown.
What you did get, you only got it because Labour voted for it, because Tory MPs were voting against it. What we supported was what Boris Johnson put down.
You've had your chance.
Yep, well, I'm telling you the truth.
Plan B restrictions we put in were criticised by Labour. They wanted more restrictions.
We voted for them.
They wanted more restrictions at every single point. And I think the point Anne made around the medical advice, of course you've got to listen to medical advice, but that's what it is, advice. And the judgments made by the government and the Prime Minister have actually been the right ones.
All right, well, we're still obviously expecting that statement this afternoon, despite the delay to the Cabinet meeting. We're also awaiting the outcome of the Metropolitan Police investigation into parties at Downing Street and Whitehall. Apparently, nearly 90 people have been issued with questionnaires, including the Prime Minister. Number 10 said that Boris Johnson returned his completed form last Friday, and they will reveal if the Prime Minister, I think only the Prime Minister, receives a fixed penalty notice for breaking COVID rules. Now, some in the Conservative Party have already implied it would be difficult for Boris Johnson to continue as Prime Minister if he is found to have broken the law, COVID rules. So far, Boris Johnson has refused to engage on the issue, as highlighted in this interview with Sophie Rayworth on the BBC yesterday.
If the police find that you have broken the law, broken your own laws that you wrote, will you resign?
Can I just undertake to make sure that as soon as I have something meaningful to say about this, which will be at the end of the process, I will make sure I do it.
If you are found to have broken your own laws,
I understand
will you stay in your job?
I understand the question you're raising, but any answer would be interpreted as a point of commentary about the process. I've got to leave.
It's a matter of principle, surely. It's not a point of commentary.
I've got to leave. You must forgive me. I can't comment.
Once the police come back and they tell us what happened and whether or not you broke the law, whether or not you will be fined, at that point you will have to decide.
Nothing would give me greater pleasure than to give you full and detailed answers to all this stuff. I genuinely can't.
You're obviously choosing not to. Were there parties in your flat during lockdown?
Can I just respectfully, humbly, and with all, I can't say anything more about this.
Why not, Bim? Why can't the Prime Minister answer in principle the question, which is, should a Prime Minister resign if found to have broken the law in any regard?
Because when you're dealing with something like this, with an ongoing investigation,
but it's not going to prejudice
it's very, very important.
Well, we're talking about fixed
I think that you've got to
notice.
wait. Well, I think you've got to wait because I think that it would depend on what the circumstances are if you're making a general judgment about breaking any rules at any given time for any individual member of Parliament or minister. I think my personal view is that the ministerial code is very clear, and that is the thing that that Prime Ministers are always judged by. But that is a separate point from the one around exactly what happens in relation to this questionnaire or the police investigation.
Alva, why won't he answer the question?
He doesn't know what to say, and has presumably taken legal advice not to say anything more at this stage and to just buy himself some more time. I think we're just in a ridiculous situation now where not only does Boris Johnson have to answer questions like that in that way, everyone in his party has to too. Like poor Bim has to come on this show and fudge some sort of answer because he doesn't really know what to say. In fact, actually though, the point about the ministerial code applying, I think, is worth noting there. But it's so difficult. Everyone in the Conservative Party is forced to defend this Prime Minister. He's sort of limping on, incredibly weakened, but MPs haven't submitted their letters yet. They don't know who the successor should be. Even if they do, they feel like it's not the right time for them. And just all of governance and basically all of British politics is just hampered now by this weakened Prime Minister at the top.
And what did you mean, Bim, precisely, when you said that the ministerial code is what counts here? If Boris Johnson is found to have breached the ministerial code, then he should resign.
Well, the ministerial code is what all ministers of the Crown have to abide by.
Right.
That is the point. What I'm saying is I think it's very dangerous to get into a position of dealing with hypotheticals around police investigations of which I personally, for example, have no knowledge at all. And so you can't get... It's very tempting for journalists to always say...
But you're very clear in terms of the ministerial code. I mean, Anne,
that's just the case.
All right, but Anne, where do you stand? I mean, if Boris Johnson receives a fixed penalty notice from the Metropolitan Police for having breached his own COVID rules that were legal restrictions, will he have to resign? Should he resign?
Could you all please just lift up your eyes and look at the scene? We are negotiating with the US and with NATO over the Ukraine. We are negotiating with the EU over Northern Ireland. Is this really the time to say to the rest of the world, we don't know who the British Prime Minister is going to be for several months? I think the fact is that if Boris Johnson is found to have broken the law, then he must pay the fixed penalty, just as any other citizen must pay the fixed penalty. And then I think we really got to start looking at the serious stuff, not least the state of the NHS, with what Toby rightly referred to just now as the vast queues of people who didn't get treatment which they would normally have got.
Toby?
Well, I mean, I think if you think about any of our previous prime ministers, you wouldn't even imagine we'd be having this conversation. It's only Boris Johnson that would think laws that he had so solemnly come onto television to tell us about didn't actually apply to him. I suspect that he wouldn't resign because I think he's utterly without shame. I don't think we'd be talking about any previous prime minister operating in this way. He clearly has lied to Parliament on this. When he stood there in Parliament, looked us in the eye and said how shocked he was to discover that parties have been going on when he'd been attending them. So it's impossible that he hasn't disobeyed the ministerial code. So whether that or the fine is the test, any other prime minister would have gone. This one probably won't.
Anne?
I think that what you've got to ask is, as I've said, whether it's in national and international interest for him to go. But secondly, this. When he said he didn't think that there were parties going on in Downing Street, he also made it very clear that the party he attended, he thought was a work event, that civil servants and others who'd been with him all day were then just going to relax with a drink in their hand instead of with a file in their hand. And he thought it was an extension of a work event.
All right.
Actually, the more I think about that, I laughed too when I first heard it, but the more I thought about it afterwards, I thought, isn't this what normally goes on anyway? So I let the police come to their view. Let the police come to their view, and then let us carry on discussing this.
All right, very briefly, Alva, because we've got to move on.
The thing is, Anne's completely right that it would be very destabilising to have a Conservative leadership contest right now and to not know who the Prime Minister is. But unfortunately, keeping Boris Johnson in place does not fix that problem. His authority has already ebbed away. The conversations privately among Conservative MPs are still regarding who's going to succeed him and what the timetable will be. And people on the international stage can already see that this is a Prime Minister on his way out. We're already really weakened on the international stage, whether he stays or goes. And I think it'd be better to just get it over with rather than this sort of national embarrassment.
I know you've got your head in your hands, Anne, but we're going to move on because while Boris Johnson's leadership continues to be under scrutiny, senior Labour figures have been out on the airwaves setting out their position on a variety of subjects. An interview given by the Labour Deputy Leader Angela Rayner to the comedian Matt Ford's podcast has caused quite a lot of controversy in the last few days. Let's have a listen.
I mean, most people recognise soft left, so I would describe myself as soft left. But you know what, on certain things I'm not, though, because on things like law and order, I'm like quite hard line. I'm like, shoot a terrorist and ask the question second in the morning. I'm like, sorry.
No, God, they like it.
That's the most controversial thing I've ever said.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, the audience laughing there. Let's talk to Shonali Bhattacharya, who's on the National Coordinating Group for Campaign Group Momentum. Shonali, you didn't find it funny. Why not?
Well, no, I didn't find it funny. And I think there were many families across the country who wouldn't find it funny. Those comments were made at a time when the name of Jean Charles de Menezes has rightly been remembered in the news again following Cressida Dick's resignation, an innocent man who was executed on his way to work on a tube at Stockwell tube station. Other names, Harry Stanley, a father of three who was executed by the police following a tip-off that he was carrying a gun in a bag. It was actually a table leg in a bag. Mohammed Abdul Kahar, who was shot by the police after a botched anti-terror raid where police went to the wrong household.
OK, so you don't think Angela Rayner should have said it?
No, it's not a laughing matter. Okay. Comments like this, it's both a way of sort of muddying the waters around what the police are actually able to do. It's within police powers to use lethal force if necessary to protect public life. So actually what she's saying is something which is actually wholly uncontroversial, but she's saying it in a way in order, I think, to posture and to seem to be tough for the right press, which is very worrying. That's a worrying thing to do.
Toby?
I think it's important that Angela Rayner, Keir Starmer and other people on the Labour front bench make it absolutely clear that the Labour Party is tough on crime. I think you shouldn't take, I'm big fan of Matt Ford's, a long-standing friend of mine, but I don't think you should take that kind of sort of exchange too seriously. It is a comedy programme. You know, the audience were laughing there. But I think what Angela Rayner was trying to get across was that, you know, when it comes to terrorism, when it comes to keeping the country safe, the Labour government going forward will be absolutely resolute on that. Now, of course, Sonali's absolutely right to say there have been situations where the police have treated people as terrorists who weren't terrorists, and you know, we should never forget the seriousness of those situations. And of course, we expect responsible policing. But you know, in the context of that interview with Matt Ford, I think to sort of make the point that a Labour government will be absolutely resolute on terrorism was an important one today to make.
Right. Well, Sonali, isn't that a perfectly credible stance?
Well, unfortunately, it's actually worse than that, isn't it? Because Angela Rayner wasn't just talking about terrorism. In her comments, she actually went on to conflate terrorism with petty crime and antisocial behaviour. And that's extremely worrying. Like, in the current context where we're seeing an increasingly authoritarian government, that's extremely worrying that the deputy leader is trying to conflate those two things. And it does suggest it's part of a bigger context of what seems to be a drift rightwards around law and order by the Labour Party, which I think at the current moment, if we think about the past 2 years where we've had some of the most powerful protests in pursuit of racial justice, of course, Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner themselves took the knee in order to show their support for Black Lives Matter. These comments really do fly in the face of that gesture.
All right. I'm just going to show everybody this headline in City AM, exclusive. Starmer to back away from 2019 Labour manifesto with series of key speeches. What should we expect, Alva, from what Keir Starmer is going to say? Further underlining a break with the Jeremy Corbyn era?
Yeah, I think that's what we've seen Keir Starmer try to do. I think it's upset a lot of people on the left of the party, but essentially when he ran for leader, he ran to the left and he's going to run to the centre to be elected as Prime Minister if he can get there. And I think you've perfectly demonstrated Labour's problem on this, that the Labour's left flank is very uncomfortable with lines like this. Obviously, that was said in the context of a sort of late night kind of stand-up comedy show interview. But actually, I think that the Labour leadership is kind of comfortable with those kind of comments and happy enough to say, yeah, you know, no apologies, we are going to be tough on crime, because they do want to draw a line with the Jeremy Corbyn era. And I think that they hope that their voters who are less comfortable with that and their members who are less comfortable with that will know that that's not fundamentally what they mean, that the finer details of that and the way that this will have hurt a lot of people in the context that Sonali mentioned, I think that they just hope that they know that this is about signalling a broader, tougher stance on crime. But it's very tense within the Labour Party. That's a broad church, and it's hard to keep both flanks on board.
Right, and the Labour Party on a rightward march. Are you pleased to hear that Keir Starmer will be breaking completely, it looks like, with the 2019 manifesto?
I mean, it would be extraordinary if we got the result that we got in 2019 and then went back to the voters and say, you know, we'll give you another chance to get it right. Of course, we've got to make changes. We had the worst defeat we've had since the 1930s, and Keir Starmer was absolutely clear that a vote for him was a change of direction. But I think that when it comes to things like the police crime bill and the way that the government are looking to be very weak on violence against women and girls, but also looking to sort of outlaw the right to protest, and the Labour Party will be voting against that. So I think it's important to see things in the round. You know, we do believe in policing by consent. We do believe that the police in many cases have got it wrong, and we need much tougher action to make sure that the culture in the police force is right. But we also need to be absolute zero tolerance against criminals, and that also includes getting them into courts when they need to be. We've got huge backlogs in our courts, which is undermining confidence of victims.
Hardly surprising, is it, Sonali, bearing in mind the result of the last election, that Keir Starmer and Toby and his colleagues want to move away from that manifesto?
Well, I mean, Toby just said that Keir Starmer was elected on a move away from the Labour Party policies that were so popular under Corbyn, certainly in 2017. But actually, that's not true, is it? Keir Starmer was elected on his 10 pledges, which actually continued the economic radicalism of the Corbyn era, as well as specifically things like public ownership, the Green New Deal. That's what people voted for him to pursue within the Labour Party. Yes. And I have to say that right now, today we hear that bankers will be receiving the biggest bonuses that they will enjoy since the 2008 economic crisis.
All right, Shonali, let me put that to Toby. It's true, isn't it? Because actually the platform, Alva and Shonali have said, the platform that Keir Starmer stood on to get elected as Labour leader was primarily the sort of platform that Jeremy Corbyn had put in both those manifestos of 2017, 2019, and then he's moved away.
I think that the 2019 manifesto was a huge departure from 2017. I think Keir was absolutely clear during the leadership contest that it was an unrealistic in its totality. I think that Shonali described the manifesto as hugely popular. We have to shake that myth. I was on the doorsteps of Chesterfield. I'm telling you, it was not hugely popular. Now, in terms of some of the things that Keir has said, like the tuition fees, I think we will carry on with many of those things, but there will also be, of course, steps that we need to move away and show that the party's changed.
All right, let me just show everybody this graph. Anne, I'm going to get you to comment on it. I know you can't actually see it, but it is a Redfield and Wilton strategies graph. It's polling trust in political parties. You can see quite clearly that on key areas of policy, on the economy, crime and immigration, that Labour is ahead of the Conservative Party, perhaps because they are trying to redefine or restate where they are on issues like crime. Why do you think they're ahead on all these, what might be called key traditional Conservative areas?
Well, I think that what Keir Starmer is doing very clearly is trying to break away from Corbynism. Now, the Labour Party does have a massive problem because it's got a very, very large left-wing Corbynist flank. But on the other hand, it's unelectable if it goes down that route. So therefore...
And it's working because they're ahead of the Tories.
Well, I'm just trying to... May I finish?
Yes.
May I finish? Thank you. It's unelectable if it goes on that route, on the Corbyn route. Therefore, what Starmer is trying to do is to move it away from that to the point where it's electable. Now, this is the interesting thing. Will he actually be able to take the Labour Party with him on that? And if you look at the pattern of Labour Party behaviour over decades, if they think they're winning with a particular programme, they will go with it. They will turn very nasty indeed on the leader if they think that he is losing with a right-wing programme.
All right.
So I would be interested to see how sustainable this is.
All right, I'm going to say thank you to Shonali Bhattacharya for joining us today because we're going to talk about universities and university staff. We've been joined by Jo Grady, the General Secretary of the University and College Union. Welcome to you. Thousands of university staff from 68 institutions are on strike today as part of 3 weeks of action, obviously resulting in reduced teaching time for students. Why are your members striking?
Well, I'm actually really glad to be on the show to be able to talk about this today because the way in which staff are treated in HE is a bit of a dirty secret.
Higher education, yeah.
Yeah, in higher education. We have over 100,000 of people who do that teaching that you've just referred to and many other things that are on insecure contracts. Some of them are 12-week contracts. We have gender, ethnicity and disability pay gaps. We have rampant overwork, most people working 1, if not 2 days of the weekend, 50% of staff showing signs of probable depression. And then in addition to all of this, we've had a 25.5% pay cut over 13 years. And we're also looking at losing 35% off our pension scheme.
All right, I'm going to get Bim to respond in a moment. But, I mean, is it really realistic? It's quite a wish list, let's put it that way. Is it justifiable when you could say that you're punishing students by withdrawing their teaching time after they have already suffered a loss during the pandemic and they're still being charged £9,250 a year?
Again, a very good question to ask. The higher education sector currently has over £40 billion of reserves. The pay increase that we're asking for would cost approximately £1.25 billion. And moreover, 22 Russell Group universities, which were in dispute over our pension scheme and others, just this year in 2020-21 had a surplus of £2.2 billion.
I mean, that's not justifiable, is it? I mean, they're amassing all this money. What's the government doing to force universities to deal with this strike?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that I just do not want to see students, young people, suffer anymore. I think they've had a horrible time over the last couple of years. And I think that the focus for everybody should be on getting their education as back to normal as possible. In relation to the point around the money, look, I don't know about those figures. I suspect that in some institutions they've amassed a lot. In others, they may have amassed less money. But fundamentally, the universities do have the resources, it strikes me. Obviously, there has to be negotiation. There'll be all sorts of discussions around conditions. Yeah. But fundamentally, the universities have to sort this out. But the right way of dealing with this from the lecturers is not to punish the very young people who have gone through such a tough time over the last couple of years. The Universities Minister, Michelle Donelan, was forced to say only the other day that all universities should be in-person teaching. You know, there's some universities still not getting back to normal. These young people pay a lot and they've suffered enough, and they've got to get back to work. The lecturers have to get back to work. The students want to be at work.
Lecturers are back to work, and quite frankly, to say that they haven't been is shameful. They've been at work throughout the...
They're proposing to go on strike.
Can I finish, please? They've been at work throughout the entire pandemic. We are taking strike action because negotiation, university vice-chancellors are not engaging with it. 73% of students support the strike. They've been on picket lines. If you're going to be pointing the finger at anybody, you should be pointing the finger at the people who lead the sector, who have failed the sector. This is industrial action for the 4th year in a row. And really, I agree with what Jo was saying. What is your government doing to actually assist? What are you doing?
Well, what I'm not saying they are blameless at all. I started my comments by saying that the universities themselves need to obviously take a lead on this. But I do not think when you have these disputes, when the lives and futures of these young people are at stake, I do not think the right way of dealing with it is strike action, because it's punishing not the vice-chancellors or these universities on their hundreds of £1,000s salaries. The people who are being punished are the young people.
And we as a union appreciate that. Sorry, one last thing.
I was going to say that. Can you answer that specifically, though, about the young people and their future?
But the point is investment in staff is investment in students. University vice-chancellors, some of whom earn £500,000 a year, are refusing to do the basics that they can afford. 1.2 billion in a sector with over 40 billion reserves. This is not a cash-strapped sector. Vice-chancellors who lead are choosing to allow these strikes to continue.
Right. I mean, why is it that universities cannot be forced, if you like, to the negotiating table if they have amassed, been reported in the newspapers, they have over £2 billion worth of cash amongst Russell Group universities?
I think because up until now they've got away with it. I mean, I think I would say, not with my political journalist hat on, but as someone who was a student, you know, not that long ago, the strain on our lecturers was really apparent, and on younger PhDs on our lecturers. And I think that there isn't a voice of actual students here, and I know that I'm not that anymore. But I think that, for all that there won't be a universal view among students on this, I think there was a feeling of concern for the more junior lecturers, the people. Right. I think that more senior lecturers and professors enjoy a much different way of life, a much more stable career to compare with the precarity of people in their sort of late 20s and 30s. And the thing is that ultimately that will impact on students in the longer term. I take the point about strike action, but it is really damaging to the educations of students if actually we're straining our staff in that way.
Well, where's Labour? Do you support these strikes?
Well, I think the first thing to say is someone who has been the parent of a child who was missed a lot of his third year. I don't look old enough, but it's true. In terms of where the UCU are, you know, I absolutely sympathise that the university, the government have not been coming to the table. No one wants to see strikes, but eventually unions do get to the point where they have no choice but to strike. And I think the UCU are in a very difficult position. I think the point made about the university surplus is important to say. There is a difference between some some Russell Group universities and the position that some other universities are in.
Having listened to Jo, do you support the strikes?
Eventually, unions get to the point where they have no choice but to strike, and if the union feel that there's no other choice, that is a legitimate thing for a set of workers to do.
All right, so it sounds like you do. That's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. Thank you to all of my guests for joining us today. Thank you, Jo, for coming into the studio. And, of course, I will be back at the same time tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15. Please join me then. Have a very good afternoon.